In less than 30 minutes, one of the most professional armies on the face of the earth walked across an open field and was essentially erased. 2,000 British soldiers, hardened veterans who had broken Napoleon's finest forces across the battlefields of Europe, were cut down on a strip of Louisiana mud. The men defending that mud lost fewer than 100. This is the story of how it happened and why it was always going to end this way. Subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss an upload. By the autumn of 1814, the War of 1812 had dragged on for over 2 grinding years, and neither side had anything to show for it. The conflict had begun with American ambitions of seizing Canada and British determination to contain American expansion and protect its commercial interests in the Atlantic. Both objectives had largely failed. The Americans launched a series of invasion attempts along the Canadian border that collapsed in a succession of poorly planned and badly executed disasters. The British, meanwhile, were fighting the war with one hand tied behind their back, their attention, their resources, and their finest military minds consumed by the far more consequential struggle against Napoleon Bonaparte on the European continent. The War of 1812 was, for Britain, an irritating sideshow to the main event. For America, it had become a source of profound national embarrassment. The nadir came in August of 1814, when a British expeditionary force marched into Washington, the capital of the United States, and put it to the torch. The Capitol building burned. The White House burned. Government offices, public records, the symbols of the young republic's national identity, all of it reduced to charred ruins by the same army America had fought a revolution to escape. The psychological wound was enormous. The republic was barely 3 decades old, and its capital lay in smoking ruins. Then Baltimore held. The defenders of Fort McHenry turned back a British naval bombardment in the engagement that would inspire the national anthem, and the war lurched back toward a grinding stalemate. In the Belgian city of Ghent, diplomats from both nations were already seated across tables from one another, arguing over fishing rights and territorial boundaries, searching for a peace agreement that neither government could afford to delay much longer. But the armies did not know this. The killing continued while the diplomats negotiated, and the British High Command had already settled on one final ambitious stroke before any treaty could be signed. A powerful expeditionary force would be sent to seize New Orleans, take control of the Mississippi River, and plant a permanent British strategic foothold at the economic throat of the American continent. New Orleans was not simply a city. It was the single most strategically valuable piece of geography in North America, and anyone who understood commerce understood exactly why. The Mississippi River was the central artery of the entire American interior. Every bushel of grain, every barrel of salted pork, every bale of cotton produced across the vast western territories east of the Rockies and west of the Appalachians moved down that river toward the Gulf of Mexico. The plantations of the South, the farms of the frontier, the emerging settlements pushing steadily westward, all of them depended on the Mississippi as their only practical connection to the markets of the world. New Orleans sat at the mouth of that artery like a valve. Whoever controlled the city controlled the flow of everything. If Britain seized it, the consequences for the young United States would be immediate and catastrophic. The Western territories would be cut off from the eastern seaboard economically. American expansion would be strangled before it had fully begun, and Britain would hold a permanent bargaining chip of almost incalculable value, one that could be used to extract concessions in any future negotiation, or, if negotiations failed entirely, to exert a stranglehold on American commercial life indefinitely. The British Expeditionary Force sailing from Jamaica understood the stakes. Their orders were direct. Land near New Orleans, overwhelm whatever militia the Americans could assemble in the time available, and secure the city before any meaningful reinforcement could arrive. The force being sent was not a collection of garrison troops and colonial militia. It was a veteran army, fresh from the campaigns of the Iberian Peninsula, soldiers who had marched under the Duke of Wellington across Spain and Portugal and France, who had broken French imperial armies at Salamanca and Vittoria and Toulouse. These were men who had spent years fighting some of the finest professional soldiers in the world and winning. They expected to find backwater American militiamen. They expected an anthill. They expected to be home before summer. Andrew Jackson arrived in New Orleans in December of 1814, looking nothing like a savior. He was gaunt from a prolonged bout of dysentery that had left him hollow-eyed and visibly diminished. His frame held together more by sheer ferocious will than by anything resembling physical health. His officers looked at him and worried privately. His enemies looked at him and underestimated him catastrophically. Both groups were misjudging the same quality in the same man. Jackson was not the kind of commander who waited for permission or precedent. The moment he arrived in New Orleans and assessed the situation, he declared martial law across the entire city. It was a legally questionable decision that would later earn him significant political controversy. It was also tactically brilliant. Under martial law, Jackson could commandeer supplies, conscript labor, requisition materials, and organize the city's chaotic population into something resembling a functional defensive force without the delays and arguments that civilian authority would have introduced. And the population he had to work with was extraordinary in its diversity and deeply unusual as a military asset. His force included regular United States Army soldiers, disciplined but dangerously few in number. Tennessee and Kentucky militia formed the backbone of the defensive line, many of them frontier riflemen who had grown up hunting deer and wild turkey in dense forest from the time they could carry a gun. Men who could reload a long rifle while crouching behind a tree stump and consistently put a ball through a target the size of a man's head at distances that would have seemed impossible to a European soldier trained on the musket. Free black soldiers from New Orleans formed their own organized units, fighting for a country that extended them only the most marginal legal recognition. Choctaw warriors joined the line. Creole gentlemen from the city's old French families volunteered. And then there were Jean Lafitte's Barratarian pirates, smugglers and privateers who knew every bayou and hidden waterway in the Louisiana Delta, and who possessed stockpiles of gunpowder and flints that Jackson desperately needed. Lafitte offered his men, his knowledge, and his supplies in exchange for pardons. Jackson accepted without hesitation. This mismatched coalition was about to hold a line that no conventional military analysis would have predicted it capable of defending. Jackson's choice of defensive position was the decision that made everything else possible, and it revealed a tactical instinct that military historians have studied ever since. He selected a narrow strip of land running along an old drainage channel known as the Rodriguez Canal, located roughly 5 miles south of New Orleans, on the road the British would have to travel to reach the city. The position was defined by two natural boundaries that could not be flanked or circumvented. On one side ran the Mississippi River, wide and swift and impassable without boats. On the other side lay a cypress swamp of impenetrable density, choked with standing water, tangled root systems, and vegetation so thick that moving through it in any kind of formation was practically impossible. Between those two boundaries, the usable corridor of ground was approximately 1 mile wide. Any attacking force coming from the south would be funneled directly into that corridor with no option to maneuver around the flanks. There was no other route to the city. Jackson ordered his men to deepen the existing drainage canal into a proper defensive ditch and pile the excavated earth into a rampart running the full width of the corridor from the river to the edge of the swamp. Cotton bales commandeered from surrounding plantations were stacked along the top of the rampart to absorb incoming musket fire. Elevated firing platforms were constructed so that multiple ranks of riflemen could fire in overlapping volleys without interfering with one another. Artillery batteries were positioned at carefully calculated intervals along the full length of the wall, their fields of fire calibrated to cover every yard of open ground between the rampart and the southern horizon. The ground in front of the position was flat, open, and entirely without cover. No trees, no fencing, no walls, no ditches, no terrain features of any kind that an advancing soldier could shelter behind or use to break up the line of fire. It was not a battlefield in any conventional European sense. It was a firing range with walls on 3 sides and a wall of guns on the 4th. The British would have to cross several hundred yards of that open ground in tight military formation to reach it. Jackson's men would be waiting the entire time. The British Expeditionary Force numbered roughly 8,000 men in total, though the primary assault on the morning of January 8th would be carried out by approximately 3,000 of them. They were not the kind of soldiers that that American commanders had encountered in most previous engagements of the war. These were not garrison troops or colonial levies or raw recruits filling out the ranks of an undermanned regiment. They were professional soldiers of the line, men who had spent years in the crucible of the Peninsular War, drilling in the precise, close-order tactics of European linear warfare and testing those tactics against the finest army France could field. They carried muskets and bayonets. They had been taught to advance in tight formation, shoulder to shoulder, maintaining their dressing, stepping over their fallen comrades, and closing the gaps in the line without breaking stride. This was how European armies fought. This was how battles had been won for a century. It was an approach that assumed both sides would be operating in the open, that the shock of a disciplined mass moving in unison would break an enemy's nerve before his firepower could break a column's momentum. Their commander was Major General Edward Pakenham, the Duke of Wellington's brother-in-law and a decorated veteran of the Peninsular campaigns. He was brave, aggressive, and absolutely certain in the superiority of British infantry discipline over anything the Americans could put in the field. His assault plan called for coordinated attacks by multiple columns with a critical flanking maneuver designed to cross the Mississippi River by boat, land on the opposite bank, and silence the American artillery batteries there before the main assault went in. If the flanking force succeeded, the guns that could rake the advancing columns from the side would be neutralized. The plan required precise timing and coordination across multiple separate elements. It was exactly the kind of plan that looks clean on paper and falls apart the moment it meets actual conditions on the ground. The British began forming their assault columns while it was still dark on the morning of January 8, 1815. Cold, damp air settled across the Louisiana lowlands, and the breath of thousands of men misted around their faces as sergeants moved through the forming ranks, checking equipment, and officers studied their watches in the pre-dawn blackness. Before the first light showed on the horizon, the plan had already begun to unravel. The boats assigned to ferry the flanking force across the Mississippi River were delayed. The river current was running harder than anticipated, and a canal connecting the launch point to the river had partially collapsed, reducing the number of available vessels below what the operation required. The men who were supposed to cross the river and silence the American artillery on the far bank would not be in position when the main assault stepped off. Pakenham received these reports in the darkness and faced a decision that would define the entire engagement. He could delay the assault until the flanking force was properly positioned and the coordination his plan depended on could actually be achieved. Or he could attack now, accepting the risk and trust that 3,000 disciplined veterans could carry the American line by sheer momentum before the artillery could do its worst. The element of surprise was already gone. Jackson's scouts and Lafitte's Baratarians had been tracking British movements through the bayou for days. The American rampart was fully manned, every cannon loaded, every rifleman in position, waiting with the particular calm patience of men who have chosen their ground and know what they are about to do. Pakenham chose to attack. In the thin gray light of a January dawn, the columns stepped off onto the open ground south of the Rodriguez Canal. Drums beat the pace. Officers on horseback rode alongside the advancing formations with drawn swords. The men marched in the precise lockstep that had been drilled into them since their first day in uniform, shoulder to shoulder, bayonets fixed, moving the way they had always moved, the way that had always worked. They had never faced anything like what was waiting for them. For a few minutes, as the British columns crossed the open ground, the fog provided a degree of cover, their formations ghostly shapes moving through the mist. Then the fog began lifting, and the men in the leading ranks saw the American line for the first time. A long, low rampart stretching the full width of the corridor from the river to the swamp. Dark cannon mouths spaced at intervals along its length, and above the parapet, the silhouettes of hundreds of men absolutely motionless, rifles resting on the muddy lip of the wall, waiting. Jackson had given his defenders explicit orders: hold fire, let them come. Every yard closer was another yard of accuracy guaranteed. Then the American line erupted. Artillery fired first, a rippling series of detonations that shattered the morning stillness and sent clouds of iron grapeshot screaming across the open ground into the packed British formations. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. Whole sections of the advancing columns were swept away in an instant. Men who had been marching shoulder to shoulder were suddenly gone, and the men behind them stepped forward and were hit in turn. Then the rifles opened up. The frontier marksmen were firing at ranges well inside 100 yards at bright red targets packed so densely together that a missed shot would strike the man beside or behind the intended target. The volleys were near continuous, overlapping, unrelenting. The leading ranks of the British columns began to dissolve. Men stumbled over the bodies of the men who had been in front of them moments before. Then the most devastating single failure of the entire assault revealed itself. The advance parties assigned to carry the sugarcane bundles and wooden scaling ladders, the tools essential for crossing the ditch and climbing the rampart, had become separated from the main column in the smoke and chaos. When the first British soldiers staggered to the edge of the canal, they found a ditch they could not cross and a wall they could not climb. They stood at the edge of that ditch under point-blank fire, with no way forward, and a field of dead and dying men stretching behind them. In some sections of the British line, casualty rates reached 70% within the first 15 minutes. Companies that stepped off at dawn with 60 or 80 men were reduced to scattered handfuls, crouching among the dead with nowhere to go and no orders to follow. General Pakenham watched his assault disintegrate from behind the stalled columns and made the decision that cost him his life. He spurred his horse forward, riding toward the front of the stopped formations with his hat raised above his head, shouting for his men to advance, trying through the force of personal example to reignite a charge that had stalled under murderous fire. His horse was shot from beneath him. He hit the ground, got up, seized a staff officer's horse, and rode forward again into the thickening smoke. A burst of grape shot or musket fire struck him in the arm. He kept riding, bleeding, still shouting orders that were swallowed by the roar of the guns. Then a second impact struck him, devastating and mortal. He slumped forward over the horse's neck, and aides rushed through the fire to drag him from the saddle. They carried him to the base of a live oak tree at the rear of the field and laid him on the ground. He was bleeding out and would be dead within minutes, far from the rampart he had been trying to reach and far from the battlefields of Spain where his reputation had been made. His second in command, General Samuel Gibbs, attempted to rally a portion of the stalled column and press the assault forward. Within minutes, Gibbs was also struck down and mortally wounded. In the span of a few terrible minutes, both of the two most senior British commanders on the field were dead or dying, and command fell to General John Lambert, who stood with the reserve further back and could see well enough from there to understand that the battle was already lost. One final organized surge materialized. The 93rd Regiment of Foot, Scottish Highlanders, advanced further toward the American line than any other unit had managed. The sound of bagpipes cutting through the thunder of the guns in the last defiant gesture of a dying assault. They were cut down at the same killing range that had destroyed every unit before them. Lambert ordered the withdrawal. The field between the rampart and the British starting position was covered with bodies. The American casualties, when the count was finally taken, numbered approximately 71 men. Some accounts recorded as few as 13 killed. Against those numbers stood approximately 2,000 British soldiers dead, wounded, and captured, a ratio of nearly 28-1 in under 30 minutes. When the smoke finally drifted clear, and the American defenders looked out from behind their rampart at what lay beyond it, many of them fell silent. These were hunters and farmers and tradesmen and pirates, men who understood violence in the way that frontier life demanded, but who had never seen anything like this. The open ground between the American line and the British starting position was carpeted so densely with fallen red-coated soldiers that one Kentucky rifleman wrote afterward that at first glance the field appeared to be covered by a sea of blood. It was not blood, he clarified. It was the color of the coats, but there was blood too. pooling in the low ground, darkening the mud of the canal, soaking into the Louisiana earth in quantities that made the air taste of copper. Under flags of truce, American and British soldiers moved across that same ground together, lifting broken men onto stretchers, sharing water, binding wounds. Enemies of an hour ago kneeling together in the mud, performing the same quiet acts of mercy. In New Orleans itself, church bells rang when the news arrived. The city had been saved, but the celebration carried a bitter undertone for those who traveled down to see the field in the days that followed. Then came the final irony that history has never quite been able to absorb. The Treaty of Ghent, formally ending the War of 1812, had been signed by American and British diplomats on December 24, 1814. 2 full weeks before the battle was fought. The war was already legally over. The signatures were already drying on parchment in a Belgian city while men bled out on Louisiana mud. 2,000 men died in a battle that did not need to happen. But the battle's legal irrelevance changed nothing about its impact. Andrew Jackson became the most famous man in America overnight, and his road to the presidency began on that rampart. The era of marching in bright columns toward entrenched guns was ending. A Kentucky farmer with a long rifle behind a wall of mud and cotton had just demonstrated what the next century of warfare would look like. History pivoted on a strip of Louisiana swamp, and the earth that absorbed those 2,000 men has never fully given back what it took.